in the DRC, heading up the MONUC mission in the Congo. I've been privileged to know and to work with Alan over earlier years during his tenure when he was heading up the UN mission in another easy spot, that of Liberia, and taking on the Congo, the largest UN mission in the world. He has taken on an even more formidable challenge, but I think we're all very fortunate that he is in that place. He was appointed by the UN Secretary General to serve as Special Representative in the DRC in October 2007. From 2005 to 2007, he was a Special Representative in Liberia for the Secretary General there. And prior to that appointment, served as Principal Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General to Côte d'Ivoire. Mr. Doss was the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sierra Leone, while concurrently serving as United Nations Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator, and United Nations Development Program Resident Representative. There are a few diplomats with a degree of his both experience and competency over the years, and I'm really very pleased to be able to have him here today to discuss the latest on the ground in the DRC, one of the most difficult and continuing challenges in post-conflict reconstruction in the world. Alan, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Howard, first for that nice introduction, and good to see you again. We've worked, as you said, very closely on a number of issues in different countries, so it's good to be here chez vous. It's also good to see a lot of old friends in the audience. I didn't realize I was from people I've worked with in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Côte d'Ivoire, and of course now in the Congo. So perhaps after this I'll have a moment to say a few words to, as I say, a number of friends and what I've had the pleasure of working with on a whole series of countries that seem to have gone through conflict or bringing conflict to an end. And because, as you know, when you've had a little bit of success in one place, they immediately put you in the UN, at least in somewhere where you're sort of gradually edge you towards the cliff and say, well, look over the cliff, and as you're about to fall over it, they say, well, this will be challenging. So Congo is certainly challenging, and I'm coming back, actually. I was there 20 years ago when Marshal Lavi, President Mobutu, was then the head of state, and it's very interesting, I say, coming back after 20 years to see that a lot of the issues we dealt with at the time, of course, are still very much there, still on the table, and we are still struggling with them. But today I thought I'd say just a few words about where we are with the mission in the Congo. I know many of you are very, very familiar, probably more familiar than I am, about the Congo and about the DRC. But I thought I'd say a few words and then perhaps have some questions, and hopefully I'll have some answers. The reason I'm here, in fact, was because I was at the Security Council day before yesterday to present the report of the Secretary General on the situation in the Congo and the work of MONUC. What I was able to say is that yes, there is some progress, particularly if you look back where the country was, as many of you know, 3-4 years ago. Most of the country is at peace, relative peace. The economy is slowly beginning to revive. There is growing interest, admittedly, in a few key sectors, in particular the mineral sector. And so we do see, as I say, some progress, and again, a country that has emerged from a decade of terrible conflict. But the problems aren't solved by far, and again, all of you know that as well as I do. And I was able to report a little bit on what we've been doing, particularly in the East. The Security Council had, in renewing the mandate of MONUC last year, emphasized that we should give priority to 2 or 3 things. One, of course, was stabilization in the East. 2 was protection of civilians, and as part of that, dealing with the issue, or helping to deal with the issue, of sexual violence. The 4th area was preparation for local elections, Fifth was supporting, with partners, security sector reform. These were some of the key areas that we've been involved with. And then perhaps more broadly, recovery and institution building, although not necessarily MONUC itself, but through the UN and partners, in particular dealing with the rule of law and, of course, the huge difficulties that we face, or the country faces rather, in trying to take the country forward and to return state authority and resurrect the justice system. I hesitate to even use the word resurrect, because even 20 years ago the justice system in what was then Zaire was pretty fragile. What I was able to say to the Council as regards Eastern Congo is that, of course, we're moving now very much to implement the two agreements that have been signed, the so-called Nairobi Communique, which is meant to deal with the problem, the lingering problem of the ex-Rwanda forces, signed last November in Nairobi by Rwanda and the DRC, with the facilitation of the international community, and in particular the United Nations, the European Union and the United States. And then, of course, Goma, the acts of engagement, the acte d'engagement, signed in January. One of the first things I did was to join that conference. And where are we on that, the implementation of Goma? I think I was able to say, well, two or three things. One, that first, and I think this is important to underline, that the two are two sides of the same coin. In my view, we will not see great progress in implementing the Goma agreements if we don't see concomitant progress on following up on the Nairobi Communique and vice versa. I think that's very important. They're not linked in the sense that they're joined at the hip. There's a reference in the Goma agreements to the Nairobi Communique, but they're not actually formally linked beyond that. But nevertheless, politically, they're very closely linked. So we need to make sure that we're advancing, I think, on both levels. On the Nairobi Communique, because that was the first one that was signed, I have to be honest, and I was honest, I believe, with the Council, saying that we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked. We must clearly accelerate our efforts to push ahead. If we want Rwanda to buy into all of this, then clearly they must have the sense that this is now serious, that we are really trying to deal with the FDLR problem through various means. Our approach has been very much to concentrate on the political and diplomatic tracks, but to recognize that we must maintain military options to also back up what we're trying to do on the political and diplomatic tracks. On the political track, emphasizing the sensitization effort by the Congolese themselves, that the FDLR, the ex-Rwanda forces, are not just a Rwanda problem, as the tendency has been to say, well, that's a relic, a reminder or a unfinished business from 1994. It is that to some extent, to a large extent, but the FDLR have become a Congolese problem. I keep saying it's Congolese women that are being raped by FDLR elements. It's Congolese children that are being abducted, and it's Congolese natural resources that are being illegally exploited and exported. So changing that mindset within the Congolese establishment is, in my view, very, very important for them to understand the FDLR is no longer what it was, a proxy army to help deal with Rwanda, but they themselves have a great interest now in trying to definitively end the problem. At the same time, getting them to send that message, unambiguous message, to the FDLR, and particularly to end collusion and co-location with FDLR, because it is there, Rwanda knows it, we know it, and we have to end it. Difficult though that will be. On the diplomatic track, we've had, I think, some success there with the adoption, surprisingly quickly, by, for the first time ever, I think, a resolution that focuses exclusively on the FDLR, which is 1804, which was approved, I think, about 5-6 weeks ago, which clearly targets the FDLR and also allows for certain sanctions. We all know the strengths and weaknesses of sanctions regimes. Some of us here, I mean, see Pete Chavez is here. We went through this in Sierra Leone with the sanctions on diamonds and so forth, in Liberia with timber. But this one, in the sense that it allows us to target, if the member states so wish, or the Security Council members so wish, to identify and target individuals for travel bans, asset freezes, and so forth, I think could be quite helpful, because it will send to those inside the Congo as well as outside that you run the risk here. If you continue to aid and abet criminal activities by the FDLR, you could find yourself on that list. And the Congolese government has no control over that directly, as you know. It's the Security Council itself. So it's, I think, another useful instrument. It's not perfect by any means, but a useful instrument to ratchet up the pressure. We've also been asking the Rwandans to be quite flexible, to be more open in encouraging returns. We had a bit of a problem, as you know, with the so-called genocide list. As part of the Nairobi communique, it was agreed that the government of Rwanda would send a list of suspected génocidaires. It turns out that the list had 6,974 names, I think, on it, which just happened to coincide, in everybody's opinion, with the number of FDLR. So that actually was a bit of a setback. It was, frankly, I think, it wasn't the best thing to do. I understand how it came about, and I think it was, at the time, it happened. But I think it hasn't been all that helpful, and I think now basically we recognize that we have to put that list essentially on one side and focus on a much smaller number who are being documented, indicted as war criminals, in particular by the ICTR, who may be living in the Congo. The third element of the diplomatic track, which I think is very important, is the European commitment to deal with FDR leaders in Europe. There are a number of them there. They're living in relative comfort, but sending back very extremist messages back to their followers or groups in the Congo. We need to break that link. We need to make it clear that you cannot sit in the comfort and relative security of Europe while you continue to diffuse hate messages and in messages of intransigence. I think Europe is now willing to move on some of these elements. Obviously, I can't speak for the Europeans, but I think again it all adds to the effort we're making collectively to bring the FDLR to disarm and disband. The third dimension, of course, is military pressures. And there we've been talking very much both to the Rwandans and to evidently to the DRC. The UN is in a somewhat ambiguous position here, because it's popularly assumed that we have a huge number of troops. It is indeed currently the largest peacekeeping force, but it's spread out throughout eastern Congo. Even though 90% plus of our forces are now in the eastern DRC, it's still pretty thin. You know, in South Kivu alone, which is the size of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, we have 4,000 troops to cover that whole area. That includes support troops and so forth. The equivalent, I think, analogy which brings it home is that what we're dealing with is an equivalent of having one policeman for the whole of Manhattan and a big chunk of Brooklyn. It shows you the problem we've faced. But within that limit, and also we're obliged, according to the resolutions of the Security Council, to facilitate voluntary, it says voluntary, disarmament, disbandment, and to assist the Congolese forces, the FARDC, to do that. Well, you know as better than I that the FARDC has its problems. Their efforts last December did not meet with any success, quite the opposite. Brigades disintegrated, integrated brigades disintegrated. And the result is that the FARDC itself doesn't have the kind of capacity to launch massive integrated military operations. I think we just have to recognize that and work around that and see military pressure as an adjunct to political and diplomatic pressures. And I think we have to continue to work on that. What we have said, and I said this personally because I know Rwanda is rather skeptical and feels that this is just an excuse. What I said and said personally to President Kagame, who I met just a week or so ago, was, look, it doesn't mean to say we can't do anything, but let's be realistic in what we plan. Let's not find ourselves again like last December, planning big operations which don't really succeed. Let's be careful. Let's go for targeted operations. Let's pick and choose. And, of course, again, as part of our protection mandate, we must be careful that there is no spillover, that we don't then, in fact, there's collateral damage with the civilian populations. The NGOs, the humanitarian community, is particularly concerned that we don't launch operations that simply end up in creating more internally displaced and metastasizes the violence throughout those areas where the FDLR are present. Bearing in mind that in some areas they're fairly closely integrated with the local population, have married into local families and so forth. So we have to find that right balance there in terms of using the military option in a calibrated fashion to support, not substitute, for political and diplomatic action. On Goma, a little bit more progress, I would say, in the sense that after quite a bit of a wrangle, we now have the so-called Mixed Commission on Peace and Security established. It's starting to function. It's, as you know, under the overall leadership of Abe Malumalu, who played a pivotal role at the Goma conference. It's beginning to, the various sub-commissions and so forth have been set up as part of the broader so-called Amani program, which was the, because the Kivu conference, actually there was a series of negotiations within the overall conference. The overall conference produced the Amani program, which deals with a whole range of issues and sets up 3 commissions. But within that were the acts of engagement, which is what the Mixed Commission is about to... thank you, Howard. The Mixed Commission is focusing on. It's up and running. It's meeting. International facilitation is playing a strong role in that. And let me just open a parenthesis. By the international facilitation, I'm talking essentially about this, the whole, I wouldn't call them the Holy Trinity, but the Trinity of the European Union, the United States, and the UN. I think it is actually very interesting what's happened. We've worked very closely together with the special envoys and have together, I think, constantly been pushing pressure in the same direction. And, you know, depending on the issue, it's perhaps sometimes easier excuse me, for the United States to intervene, sometimes on other issues the European Union, and then on others it'll be the United Nations and the Security Council. But it's together, it's been, I think, a very productive partnership. We've been pushing to now get the Mixed Commission up and running. It is, and now we're getting, and now comes the hard part. Now comes the hard part. There are 3 or 4 key issues which I think will determine how far and how quickly go. The first one will be to negotiate disengagement. We have already a partial disengagement orchestrated, I think, by MONUC. We put interpositional forces to try to reduce the friction and conflict or hostilities between different groups, especially between the CNDP, the Mai Mai Pareko, and the FARDC forces. We want to see that. Of course, we want to make sure the ceasefire holds. But disengagement has to follow. There's only so long that you can keep people suspended like that. But disengagement then brings up the question, well, what will happen to these respective forces, and in particular the CNDP, who will say and continue to say, we are there to protect our populations. If we go, our populations are vulnerable to all these other groups. And we've had massacres in the past. We'll have massacres again in the future. So we have to find arrangements that enable the CNDP, not necessarily to disarm, but to reintegrate into the national forces with some guarantees. That is going to be a very tricky and difficult negotiation. Government itself is very skeptical about this because they're concerned that, well, if these forces don't really disarm and integrate themselves, they will constantly constitute a potential future menace. That will be a key issue to negotiate following on disengagement, or one leading to the other. The other area, I mean, there are many issues that will require continuing effort and support, but the other area that I see as critical is the issue of returns. IDPs, yes, and there are large numbers, you know, and there will be a lot of work to do there, including security guarantees, support for returning populations. But I think within that overall issue, returns, the core one that will create the most problems and will require, again, a lot of help is the return of refugees. Because the right to return is there. Any Congolese, it's spelled out in the Constitution. In Goma, this came up. To my surprise, it was waved off. No, they have the right to return. The question which will become difficult and will require, I think, a lot of work is who can be called a Congolese. That is what will be the issue. And it will be a difficult, delicate negotiation that we will have to persevere with the help, of course, of the High Commissioner for Refugees. Overall, as I say, we go up and down, and one thing on both these I keep emphasizing to the Council and to all our interlocutors, including you, is that, you know, peace agreements do not make peace. They set us on the road, but moving down that road requires a lot of intensive support, encadrement, accompagnement in French. We will expect bumps in the road. We will not get forward quickly in all areas. There will be periodic setbacks. It happened about 8 weeks ago, when we published a report on a massacre in a place called Kalonge. The CNDP took great offense to that, withdrew temporarily from the process, fortunately came back in. I would expect similar, you know, problems, not necessarily on that particular issue, but I think we just have to keep after it. We need the constant support, and we need the constant sense of determination, and we must not get disappointed or depressed if at one point things don't seem to be going so well. We just got to keep the people talking. You know, the old Churchill line about, you know, jaw is better than war certainly applies in these situations. But have a sense of direction, and this cannot be an open-ended process either. I think in all of this, working with the facilitation is critical. I think in particular the United States has a key role because the United States is, I think, well seen now in both Kinshasa and Kigali. It has this ability to talk to both. I think that is an important asset that we need to of course, use and have been using so far. We will also have to backfill in the sense that the UN has worked on this strategy for security and stabilization in Eastern DRC. Push ahead, disengagement, brassage, we hope, DDR, all of that will be critical. But we also have to show people that we can make a difference. So stabilization support, bringing in early assistance to help on roads, rehabilitation of key infrastructure, health, but above all, justice and the police. The rule of law has disappeared. It was always very weak, I might add. But I think early efforts in that area to help people, not only those who are returning, but those who never left, to have a sense that there is change, there is a difference, that this isn't, again, the past, always the past, coming back to the present. I think that's a big challenge for us. It will need considerable donor support. We're already receiving some, and it needs quick disbursement. I keep saying, and colleagues in the room have heard me on this story in Liberia and Sierra Leone and elsewhere, $100 today in these situations is worth $1,000 a couple of years from now. Small programs, not necessarily big things. Infrastructure, jobs, roads is my mantra. You know, just giving people a sense that things are changing. This will have to be underpinned over longer term, I think, by a broader sense of national and local reconciliation. And I do want to thank Howard and his team for the work they've done on that in Goma, and I've seen it also in Liberia, because we're dealing with fundamental problems that will not be resolved, even if Goma is a success, and Nairobi, which we're trying to make sure will be the case. There are deeper structural problems that, again, you know the Congo, know the area probably better than I, go back, you know, into the midst of time. And we must be aware of that and work to deal with these problems. Get people out of their isolation. I was talking one evening to the Abbé Malumalu, and he was saying, you know, one of the problems is that these groups, especially the Mai Mai, the CNDP, who do they talk to? They talk to themselves. And it exacerbates their own internal isolation. We have to get them out of that, talking to each other. And that was one of the most amazing things at Goma, is that we actually had for 3 weeks all these armed groups who were, you know, at each other's throats most of the time, were there talking. Sometimes the language was pretty tough, pretty nasty, but they did get through it. So that gives us some sign that things, with the right facilitation and encouragement, can change. Because I don't think we can deal with the problem over time unless we help to start rebuilding the confidence of communities. That applies equally, I would say, to the relationship between DRC and Rwanda. Both still see this as a zero-sum game. Those underlying fears and suspicions and perceptions are deeply entrenched now. Again, we're not going to overcome that in a few weeks or months, but I think working together with the help of international partners, but at all levels, not just the political and the diplomatic. I'd like to see, for example, a meeting of businessmen from the Kivus together with their counterparts in Rwanda and Uganda. Let's get the business community. This is, after all, an area that has got huge potential, much of it being drained away right now through illegal means, through illicit exports of coltan and cobalt and cassiterite. How do we get business people seeing that, hey, we have more to gain than to lose by working together? So multiplying those initiatives, both in and outside of the country and across border, I think is vital. I want to also say a word about the issue of sexual violence, which, is truly horrific. Just to cite one figure, which is not a proven figure, but I think speaks volumes. Last year, it's estimated there was something like 27,000 rapes reported in South Kivu alone. 27,000. Rape amongst some groups, armed groups, is probably now an instrument of war. It's an effort to destroy communities, not just individuals, horrific though the results are for individual women and children. A lot has already been written and said on this, and we are very much caught up in this. I know the United Nations gets criticized a lot. I have to say that we're in a way getting criticized for having brought the problem to the attention of the world through the reports of the Secretary General, through statements by my predecessor, Bill Swing, who, by the way, did a wonderful job in the Congo, and I hope everybody recognizes that. We've brought the problem to the attention of the world, but we don't have all the answers to solve that problem in our own hands. The first thing we have to do is, above all, end the influence and domination and control of the armed groups. Because unless we're able to do that, we cannot tackle the underlying problem, especially with the FDLR in South Kivu. The second thing is, of course, dealing with the national security forces, who on that are also part of the problem. I now send a monthly report to the Minister of Defence listing, based on the information we get, what all the abuses they have committed, the FARDC. It's beginning to change things. The Minister takes this seriously, I believe. He's already initiated a number of prosecutions, but it will require continuing pressure and follow-up. It will require the presence of the justice system on the ground, which is not the case now. It will need a combination of efforts if we're going to really deal with the problem. But even in other relatively stable post-conflict countries like Liberia, where I was, the problem of rape was the most frequently committed serious crime in Liberia was rape. The press was always full of stories about armed robbery and stuff, but as I kept reminding them, that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was rape. This is a part of what happens to societies when they collapse, and collapse in the horrific way that society in Eastern Congo did. So I think we will continue to focus on that. Obviously, we have to make sure our own behavior, our own troops, our own civilians, our own police respect the rules and do not engage in any such behavior. And that will remain a preoccupation for me, as it was for Ambassador Swing. In any one year, we will probably rotate through our mission 30,000, 40,000 people. It just takes one to do something awful, and it gets picked up by the international media, which it does, and everything else we do gets forgotten. So this is a constant struggle. It's a constant message I have to get across to all of our staff, our soldiers, police, and civilians, is that, you really have to be sure you respect the highest level of conduct, whether it's on the issue of sexual abuse and exploitation, whether it's about anything to do with arms trafficking or illicit exploitation of natural resources. The eyes of the world are on us, and we have to perform, and we have to perform creditably. It's a big task, but one that we just have to keep after. It's a standard now for all peacekeeping missions. I could talk on and on, Howard, as you can see. Some of you may know I come from Wales, and the Welsh are well known as being a bit garrulous. But I do just wanted to highlight a few of those issues. There's much to be said, but there is hope. I think there is hope that we are in a position with progressive efforts, not in the next week or two, but, inexorably, I hope, break the cycle of violence that has so devastated the eastern DRC and beyond. But it is just part of a broader effort. We can't neglect the rest of the country. In the Congo, for example, we've had a problem of late, as you may have read, where violence again has come back. Problems still lingering in Ituri, I have to say, although far less than what they were 3 or 4 years ago. And who knows, with the Lord's Resistance Army, what will happen now that they've walked out of the Juba, or Mr. Kone has walked out of the Juba peace accords. Country itself is faced with enormous challenges of recovery, and the economy is growing, but there are issues of transparency and corruption that need to be dealt with, governance, and we have the local elections on the horizon for next year. The Council, the Security Council, has gone along with that. They've agreed that MONUC will provide extensive assistance. It's going to be a huge job again. We'll need a significant budget for it. But I think that is important. If we can complete the electoral cycle, it will help to deepen the democratic procedures and processes. But again, there's a lot to do, and I wouldn't want to pretend for a minute that MONUC is the answer. The answer lies, above all, with the Congolese. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that wonderful overview. I was so pleased that the starting point and your focus was the Nairobi Agreement and dealing with this issue of getting control over the armed groups, which remains at the end of the day, will remain the central issue, without which, resolving that, there will be no stability within the region. Just a little anecdote that you might enjoy to reinforce the days that are bad, because we've seen the highs and lows in the Congo are extraordinary every other day. Yeah. But we've been working, as you noted, with all the armed signatory groups we've convened. We've had 2 workshops with us actors in the weeks immediately following the signing of the Goma Accord, and to demonstrate the potential and the potential hopefulness of the future. On the second of these workshops, after we did some of our initial training, in terms of the communications and negotiations work we do, directed to building of some trust and confidence, we broke these guys out into working groups to talk about what practical steps to monitor and the implementation of the ceasefire on the ground. And they broke out into working groups around certain topics they had discussed, identified. And in these groups, they each began to share with each other, these are Nakunda's people, the CNDP, and the Mai Mai elements, their own vulnerabilities, in which each would start to say, well, you're right, we have been recruiting, or you're right, we did bring an arms shipment in violation of the accord, or, well, we don't really control these people, even though we're supposed to, we don't have real control over them. When people begin to share that degree of, in that transparent a way, their own vulnerabilities and their own sensitivities with the other, that's a sign of a beginning, or at least the potential for the kind of collaborative effort that is going to be required here. So those moments are important to hold on to.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Please, let's open it up for questions, and could you identify yourselves and your affiliation, please? There's a microphone that'll be accompanying you.
Conrad Huber from USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. I had 2 questions. Actually, Howard referred to one of the names that you didn't mention in your remarks, Laurent Nkunda's name, and I was wondering if you could just comment on what you see as his future, whether as a man of war or a man of peace. And the other question I had was more of a conceptual one, which is maybe to ask you to reflect on what the potential risks are that we might face in the implementation of the Goma Agreement. It's essentially a ceasefire agreement, and as you indicated, the idea is to build on that and to have people talk through all the other nettlesome issues that will then be resolved and build something greater and more stable. Another approach to a peace process would be to not settle anything until everything is settled, in a more comprehensive approach. And I'm just wondering what the risks are that we're running in trying to, maybe it's the only alternative we have, but on trying to build from a relatively narrow ceasefire agreement into something broader. You indicated the issue of integration of armed groups into the FARDC. There are other issues, I believe, of even power sharing, wealth sharing, and so forth in the Eastern Congolese context that are still very much in the balance.
Hey, should we take a few questions?
Yeah, please.
In the middle of the audience there? Can we get a microphone there? Rosaline? Oh, good.
Hi, thank you for taking my questions, and thank you for being here today. I have a hard time gauging Joseph.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Ebony. I'm from IRC. I have a hard time gauging Joseph Kabila as a political leader. What are your thoughts about him and his effectiveness as a leader regarding decentralization of government, security sector reform, and hard decisions regarding corruption? And the second question is regarding the mining of natural resources. What has been done by Kabila and what needs to be done to correct the situation and gain control of various armed groups, including the Congolese army, who are exploiting the land and people? Thank you.
Thank you. And one last question over here.
Thank you for accepting my question. My name is Janet Ullman. I'm attending on behalf of Marie-Françoise Marinelli, who's the country director of the World Bank in DRC. As you are certainly aware of, the World Bank is strongly supporting the DDR process, also through a new program on decentralization, on the disintegration and disarmament, who will go to the board by next week. A question concerning your the Nairobi agreement. You've mentioned that you're facing mainly problems with the political level that you're trying to address. I would like to ask, what are your next steps, how you're going to address this problem? Thank you.
Okay. Are we live here, by the way? No Chatham House rules in Washington. All right. It's always worth remembering that.
We can do that another time.
Well, the colleague from OTI and Mr. Nkunda, it wasn't a deliberate omission on my part, frankly. He's there. We deal with him. He is a, whether you like it or not, he is a factor and has to be factored in. I can't speculate in this forum on his future, what it might hold. He seems to believe that he is not just purely a military figure. He believes he has a political agenda. He believes he speaks for his people and that he is there to defend them. He constantly, at the same time, reiterates that he's Congolese and that he sees his future in the Congo. I think he has been concerned that he has been demonized for various things, like others who are associated. He has been, I think, quite anxious and reacted very strongly to the Kalonge report. I think he is concerned that he stay away from the attentions of the ICC, if I can put it that way. And, he has pushed, he's engaged in the process. He moves back and forth in terms of his public enthusiasm for it. But this is part, I presume, of the negotiating process. We'll see now in the next few weeks about how far they're prepared to go and whether this is a good faith effort. We hope it is. In all these negotiations, and I know a number of you in this room have participated in this kind of thing, you have to take some things in good faith, otherwise you wouldn't even start it. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. I certainly hope so. And as you know, particularly the US has worked very closely with him to try to move this process forward, and I think very, very usefully. We have come some way. In terms of the risks, yes, Goma is not a comprehensive agreement in that sense. It's not like the Accra peace agreement for Liberia or the Lomé agreement for Sierra Leone. The pluses and minuses in that. Sometimes comprehensive agreements work. I think by and large the Accra agreement did work for Liberia. Sometimes they fail. Linus Marcoussi for Côte d'Ivoire is a case in point. Well, we were where we were, and we had to deal with it. I think it was very much about getting the ceasefire in place, taking account of what had happened in December with the failure of the FARDC offensive. It is narrow. The act d'engagement is not a definitive settlement of all the issues. It's not an act of settlement as such. It was clearly understood that we would have to follow up on a number of issues. But that was what we had, and that was what we could get at that time. recognizing that, yes, there would be these issues of reintegration, of disengagement, of guarantees for protection against hostilities of populations. I think it's there. We have these specific issues. It will be now a question of facilitating the negotiation among Congolese, not imposing on them. This is a process that is being run, with our help, admittedly, by the Congolese themselves, which to my mind is extremely important. This isn't about giving them a document and locking them up in an isolated airbase somewhere. They've worked on this themselves, but it will require time and energy, and there will be, I think, moments when one or others will pull back and say, hey, this isn't going where we want it to go. But at this time, I don't see an alternative, and that's what we always have to consider. What is the alternative? There didn't seem to be one. Let's see if we can make this one work with all of the inherent problems that are there. Our friend from IRC, well, I'm not about to engage in a public assessment of President Kabila. I think that would be inappropriate in my position, especially as we're being webcast, apparently. But he faces enormous challenges, as we move forward, all the things you've mentioned. I pick out amongst those security sector reform because, to my mind, particularly for MONUC, I mean, one of the key benchmarks for our drawdown will be the presence and effectiveness of the national security forces. We had this round table. I didn't mention it, but we had it in February. It took us some way. It was particularly helpful, I think, on the police and the justice. There's some difference of view between the partners, or the donors especially, and the government on the shape and direction, the architecture of the FARDC in particular. The minister has his views and some of the partners have other views. There are documents on the table shaping his vision of where we should go. My view is that we, to some extent, also need to work on SSR from the bottom up. Work with units that we can do something with. And I think the United States, for example, is interested in helping out with some training. See if some of those reshaped battalions could be brought into limited operations, targeted operations. Give them some confidence. Help them to see that they can be part of the answer and not always part of the problem. We'll see in the next few weeks and months. The arms embargo has been lifted, as you know, on the Congolese government, at least in the way it was shaped before. We'll see how they make use of that. I mean, whether this is going to lead to a splurge in arms buying, which might cause some concern, or whether this can be turned to, basically develop units in the FARDC that can be, can be effective in dealing with armed groups, protecting borders, but not become, predators, which has so often been the case in the past. I think this is one of the key challenges. The other challenge you face, which you referred to, of course, is the mineral sector. It's two dimensions, in my view. One, the whole issue of armed groups and armed groups like FDLR that are clearly involved in trafficking, and that will require, I believe, the support of neighboring states, as well as more broadly the international community. After all, the diamond problem was not solved exclusively in Liberia or Sierra Leone. It was solved, if to the extent it is solved, because we put something in place called the Kimberley process, which dealt with the importers, not necessarily the export. We dealt with both, but without the importing side of the equation, it wouldn't have worked. Can we do similar things for coltan or cassiterite or cobalt? I don't know enough about the industry to know whether that would be feasible. But it seems to me that if we're going to deal with the armed groups and their control, it has to also target their ability to continue to manipulate and use these resources. The other dimension is the concessions. The government has recently reviewed the mining law with some external assistance. I haven't, to be very honest, I haven't followed this in great depth because of so many other things to follow at the moment. I do know that the concession review hasn't met with universal applause. I think there are still issues there that have to be looked at, the mining laws and so forth. There are concerns that about the way the concessions are being awarded, but again, I'm not close enough to it at this stage to be able to formulate a real judgment. I was very much involved in this process in Liberia, which I think to some extent is something of a model. You know, a country that has sort of said, hey, a lot of these concessions didn't meet the essential test, the test of national interest. Doesn't mean to say government should run these concessions, far from it. But I think there has to be agreed somewhere, some basic test of national interest that you can then use as a frame of judgment when you review those concessions, whether they're mining concessions, forestry concessions, or other kinds of concessions. And that's tough, you know, because we know there are vested interests. There were in Liberia. I'm sure there are in the Congo and elsewhere, Sierra Leone. But I think that's a very important, and again, collectively, I think the international community, through the, for example, the Transparency Initiative, you know, the Natural Resources Initiative, I think can help in that respect. Finally, the colleague from the World Bank mentioned DDR. Yeah, I hope this is going to get approved by the bank's board. I mean, because of this, you know, it's been frozen for a year, that program. There's been no money available. Well, perhaps that was a bit of a silver lining because we weren't ready for it anyway. But I hope if all goes well, we will. So we'll need that money to come on stream fairly quickly to support the... But remember, we're talking about a backload of ex-combatants. We're not necessarily talking about new ex-combatants, and that's concerned. So we still need to mobilize some money. The other dimension of this program, which I found a bit surprising coming from with my experience in West Africa and a series of DDR programs there, is that it really is DDR. It's not DDRR or much less DDRRR, which to the cognoscenti means, I'm not sure what it means, return, reintegration and rehabilitation. But what it is just a small grant, reinsertion grant. It doesn't deal, as other programs have done, with reintegration. And that worries me a little bit because you're basically giving somebody, an ex-combatant, a small grant, $10, $15 or maybe a little more per month, and that's it. Well, knowing some of the ex-combatants, as I've done, I suspect that money's going to be quickly spent on beer and worse. There isn't been an effort to structure, reintegrate, whether it's at the individual level or the community level. So I think that's I'm not sure it happened that way, but it did. And the money we have available now from the banks, ADB as well as the World Bank, will go for the current model. But it still leaves us with this big gap, in my view. We're still putting out on the streets, literally, tens of thousands of principally, not exclusively, young men with no skills, no economic opportunity, and very little hope. And I just wonder if that's, you know, this is why I think this backfilling through stabilization is absolutely critical. And it's all our experience in West Africa shows us that. You just simply cannot assume the economy will take care of these people. It won't. Not in the first few years. So labor-intensive public works, I'm all for it. I mean, I don't say it's the future. It doesn't substitute for a vibrant private sector and private investment and trade. We know that. But that is not going to happen unless you can get those kids off the street and get some degree of stability. So I would make a plea that when we do these programs, we really need to look at that broader reintegration and stabilization dimension.
Great. I wish we had more time. I understand that you have to another appointment in just a very few minutes. I just want to thank you so much for your time here today and for the comprehensiveness of your review. There are many questions I would like to throw out, and I'm sure there are many other from the audience. But I think but I really do appreciate your candor and the comprehensiveness of your overview. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Howard. Good.
That's the best governor Michigan didn't get. How are you, brother? You all right?
just love it.
I would say it's
Calling you from name generations.
Maybe I've told you, my cousin was the mayor of Richmond, Virginia. Before Governor Wilder.
Josephine Roach on the cover.
Period.
America. Oh, now that's catchy.
He's now specialized in bank records. Has only four cars. One Mercedes.
too bad. Slightly better than running out of food. There were a lot of sideshows going on there.
He and his wife.
Remember Marshall Fund had something,
The biggest deal that
Atlantic
good
Council had
idea to have a
something.
couple of cars available. In case of repairs or accidents.
Fine.
Council
You
of
can
Lancaster.
start eating
Yes, they
now, and then
Listen,
felt if they were going to stiff on
council
the
president.
we'll start in a few.
Georgia-Ukraine membership action plan. They couldn't do it. Because we were putting a full court press for everything.
At Christmas.
Pleasure, thank you.
Oh, really?
I think they probably calculate that. That's a Democratic administration.
For watching.
It'll never get built.
Stay for what, half an hour? Yeah, half an hour, 35 minutes. Answer some
Must have
questions
10
and
minutes
look
at the
back.
funeral.